Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mormon Mental Health. This is Natasha Helper, and I'm super excited to have Drew Hansen with me today. We are going to be talking about this really new, I think, fun and exciting resource that's called Uplift Kids. And Drew has been part of the team that has developed this program. But before we get started on that, I just want to, just start with a little bit of announcements. We are at that time of year where it's the end of the year. So if you want to spend or send any of your cool donation monies to a nonprofit, Mormon Mental Health will take it. We don't bring in a lot. We don't spend a lot, but it sure is nice to have a little bit to help us with those costs, like, the website and the editing, and maybe sending a little bit to those who help us host and things like that. So I'll make sure and post a little donation button. So if any of you want to send some monies our way, that would be greatly appreciated. So thank you in advance for that. And otherwise, let's just dive in. So welcome to the program, Drew.
Thanks, Natasha. Excited to be here and to connect in this way.
Yeah, no, this is really fun. I'm excited to talk to you. We went out to lunch probably a few months ago now, and I got to hear a little bit about this resource. So I'm excited for you to talk to the audience about it. But before we get started on that, I'd love to get to know you a little bit more. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of where you come from and a little bit of the Drew Hansen story?
You bet. Let's see. Well, I was born and raised in the church, the LDS Church. I grew up on the East Coast outside Washington, D.C. And I guess I would say that I had a pretty conventional Mormon upbringing as far as that goes. Church every Sunday, actively involved. The church was certainly centered in our lives. That said, being on the East Coast and given, my father's ambitions and his career, first in the military and then in the private sector, I would say that as a young person, I was as much enculturated in the religion of success and capitalism as I was in the church itself. And as I got older, into adolescence, and started thinking more about my future, I got really interested in, what success looks like. What are the external markers? What do I need to do to win love and kind of have a good life as far as I understand it? And I think there was a way in which that affected my relationship to my own spirituality and my curiosity. And I was, outwardly very religious, but I think there was kind of an inner spiritual yearning that got pushed aside or got covered over in a way as I became more interested in kind of performing out in the world. So I served a mission and went to BYU, graduated from BYU and joined a consulting firm, Bain & Company. It's a firm that I think many listeners may have heard of because of its association with Mitt Romney. And then in my 20s, as a young single adult, I lived in New York City, where I was part of a digital media startup that we sold to Forbes. I worked at Forbes. So my professional background is a mix of business and media, technology after that as well. And in my late 20s, I went through, I guess, what at least back then we called a faith crisis. Kind of hit me pretty hard. And it was more than in faith, right? It was faith crisis, but given my background and how much of my identity centered on being Mormon, what I called it, really it was big questions about career, who am I, identity. And so in my late 20s, about almost 10 years ago now, I started to distance myself from the church, the institution, and really say yes to a spiritual adventure. I had a lot of spiritual longings, and I would say that the transition that I made with the church started with that. It started with a real hunger to commune and to, at the time I used the word worship. I would say now that I was discovering that I was a contemplative, and there was a way in which the church structures and the way that I participated in church didn't really leave a lot of room for that. There was a lot of room for service and for doing a lot of things and engaging in that way. And I was looking to, at a minimum, augment that experience. And there's a lot I could say about the last 10 years, but I, over time, found my way into Eastern philosophy and Buddhism, meditation practice. Yeah, there's a lot we could go into there. Also, my experience in therapy, that as well, and what I uncovered and how that caused me to kind of turn back on my Mormon, turn the lens back on my Mormon upbringing and confront uncomfortable truths about those experiences and how they shaped me. And I think all that also is fed into at least my contribution to what is Uplift, the program that you mentioned at the start of our conversation. And I can speak to that as well. But that's a bit of my personal background, and it kind of tees up, why Uplift is so important to me and to the team that I'm a part of.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. And if you don't mind, I'm going to go back and talk about a few of those points maybe that you made, because, well, first, I'm curious. And second of all, I think you're kind of alluding to some of these things having a role in your development of at least some of the concepts and things that you're wanting to bring to this resource. So I think it's interesting that for you and maybe for your family, Mormonism was also kind of tied to capitalism. And I think some of the terms that maybe are used by either critics or even within people within the church is prosperity gospel. I don't know if that's a term that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
So are you comfortable kind of talking about that? Because there might be also Mormons that would say, what? That's not, like the gospel isn't about money, right? Or the gospel is about something totally different. So can you talk about maybe how that might be perceived by some? Like, why would capitalism and Mormonism be something that might be tied together?
Yeah. And I can only speak from my personal experience.
Yeah.
Right? And one, I would just say that the Mormon Church, LDS Church organization and the programs are phenomenal in terms of leadership development, at least leadership as it's been understood in our current culture and contemporary capitalism, but also I think in American ways.
American, United States kind of culture is what you're saying.
Exactly. And I think just like kind of universal understandings, scholarly understandings of skills that are important in terms of leading. If leadership is a way of inspiring and motivating groups of people to align on a shared mission to accomplish work together that no one person can accomplish, then there's a lot to be said for just what someone learns, maybe particularly what a young boy and young man learns in church culture, but opportunities to take on responsibility and to be held accountable and to have responsibility for your quorum, public speaking. A lot of it's also modeled. So at any rate, there's a kind of connection there. And I've been interested for a long time in what I call like the Mormon HR lineage. So this is maybe most prominently seen in someone like a Stephen Covey, but there are other maybe lesser known to the wider public academics, professors, and kind of leadership consultants who come out of the church. I'm thinking of My mentor, Bonner Ritchie, who's an emeritus professor out of BYU, who taught organizational behavior. His students included people like Clayton Christensen. I'm forgetting Hal Gregerson, Dave Ulrich. These are like big names in the business world. If you know where to look.
Dave Ulrich was actually my bishop at one point in Michigan.
Okay, so there you go. And in addition to that, just like as someone who started his career at a consulting firm, at a top tier strategy consulting firm, our main competitor at Bain was a firm called McKinsey. And there's a saying at Harvard Business School is the 3 M's, that if you fit any one of these 3 M's, you have like a higher probability of being accepted into Harvard Business School. And they are military, McKinsey, and Mormon.
Oh, wow. That's
and the former dean of Harvard Business School, Kim Clark, he was the dean there. He's, LDS, and he left his post at HBS to become the president of BYU Idaho. So there are real deep connections between the upper echelons of, American capitalism, the business world, and our church leadership. I could go on and on about that, but
sure.
Those are some examples of where we see it manifested. Yeah.
Well, and even a lot of the skills that I think young men, and even now more and more so young women learn on missions, have a lot to do with salesmanship, again, leadership skills, things that can definitely help in the business sphere, once they come home, and help them be successful in those types of ventures per se.
Yeah. And maybe just another example, another point that I'm sure listeners, the audience is familiar with, but the news that broke some years ago about the church's $100 billion largesse and its investments with, I think, Ensign Peak Advisors, I believe is the name of the entity, the legal entity within the church that runs that, and that the team there that's doing that work, those are former investment banker, equity analyst, the church is running a hedge fund. So yeah, there's different arguments on both sides around the ethics of that and all that, but yeah.
Right. Okay. So another word that you used was contemplative. That's not a word that gets used in kind of Mormon vernacular a lot. So I would, I guess, just invite you to expand on that word and what that might mean. Not everybody may be familiar with that kind of, or maybe they've heard of it. And you even said, Eastern and Buddhism and things, but those may be foreign to a lot of people or may not be as familiar. Do you want to expand on some of those words and what they mean?
Sure, yeah. I mean, and I didn't think to use it at the time, right? Only later that I realized that there was a word for this aspect of myself that was wanting fuller expression. And I would say that when I use the word contemplative, what I mean is, a willingness to explore our interior, psychological, our interiority, our psyche, and to do that by slowing down and by meditating, perhaps like in a formal meditation practice. We tend to think of that with its associations to the East with Buddhism, but the truth is Christianity has a really powerful and long-standing contemplative tradition. Christian, contemplative practice with centering prayer is the name of the practice that I think people most commonly think of as a type of Christian meditative approach. But there are many ways that people contemplate on life. And when I use the word contemplative, it is different from thinking. It's not so much like thinking about something. Like we might use the word pondering the scriptures with Mormon LDS culture. Contemplation and meditation, in my experience, is more a practice of kind of going beyond the thinking mind and what are the other ways of knowing from our heart that can then kind of include the process of thinking about things. But mindfulness,
more like a felt experience or a holistic experience, not just intellectual. Is that maybe what you're getting at?
Yeah, and I think stillness is classically like a way in which we slow down quite literally and sit or stand in stillness, the machinations of our mind and the scripts that it runs repeatedly can begin to quiet. And if not quiet, we create a little bit of breathing room. We can step back and start to witness our own mind. And we can start to see how much of what we think about is unconscious and not serving us in any way, and even dictating how we live our life in ways that we don't want. And so there's actually freedom and choice that becomes possible when we can see directly, kind of what's going through our minds, make different choices.
Yeah, that's lovely. Okay. Well, so let's start talking about Uplift and how that starts becoming, a project, and maybe some of the relationships that lead into that. But I'll be looking for, as you start talking about that, some of what you mentioned, which is kind of your own journey. And you had mentioned therapy and the lens into some of your Mormon experiences and how that starts informing that journey. So I'm going to kind of be going back and forth to some of those things that you've been
Please
talking
do, because that could go in so many directions. So
right. So I want to give you a lot of chances to, kind of think about what that journey was like for you. So, but maybe talk about a little bit about how you even got to know some of the people that started working on that project with you.
Absolutely. First off, I'll just say Uplift is a resource for parents to help them give their kids a strong spiritual foundation. We have customers who use Uplift who are active churchgoers. We have customers who have never gone to a church. So it's really supplemental and independent of any single religious tradition. And yet we do draw upon the world's wisdom traditions, as well as modern science, the tradition, I would say, of Western developmental psychology, to inform the resources, which primarily right now are lessons, like kind of lesson plans that parents can use to start conversations with their kids about values, about pressing topics in the world, but seen through a more kind of spiritual lens. The seed for Uplift was first planted when four founders of Uplift, were in a program together through an organization called Lower Lights. And Lower Lights is Thomas McConkey's and his wife Gloria's organization, which really focuses on mindfulness and adult development and wisdom texts. And so we were in a 9-month intensive program together. And although it wasn't really part of the curriculum in an explicit way, we were being invited to really tune into ourselves and those around us, and how can we be of service, and how can we passionately engage the questions that are important in our hearts. And as we were considering that, it became really clear that not just among the four of us, but among the broader cohort, there were a number of parents who had gone through or were in some form of a faith transition. And whether they had settled on kind of an answer for themselves as to how they wanted to engage faith for themselves, now or not, all of them were wrestling with, what do I want to do around this question with my children?
Mm-hmm.
And the four of us in particular, just said, like, we want to engage with this. We don't know where it's going to lead, but we feel drawn to it.
Yeah.
And so, that kicked off a lot of just kind of research, and both secondary research, but also just a lot of conversations with parents in this kind of demographic. And we did some kind of testing of some ideas. And in January of this year, we quietly released an early version of Uplift to the public. And since then, we've added over 70 lessons to our lesson library, and they cover a range of topics. So on the one hand, we cover values or virtues that transcend time and culture. So think of kindness and forgiveness and compassion and topics like that. On the other hand, we cover things like anxiety, depression, digital technology, bullying, sexuality. So, really maybe more pressing and more immediate topics that don't, on the surface, suggest that they're spiritual. And yet what we try to do is we try to bring both the lens of wisdom and the lens of science and marry them together. What do these lenses together reveal? And like, what do they uniquely reveal that without the other, we would be missing an important perspective? And so then we do that work, and then we package up a coherent lesson plan that can be used for all ages, really. We have a devotional that parents can use to introspect for themselves on the topic, to have conversations with their partner if they're doing this together with a partner. And then for teens, for younger kids, and even for like little kids. And that way, if a whole family wants to gather together, they're able to do that and, have a coherent experience, although that's not the only way that people use the material that we offer. So that's a bit about kind of where it came from and what it is. Let me know, where else you
know. That sounds lovely. I mean, and coming from the tradition, the strong tradition of family home evening, right? And I mean, Mormon tradition focuses a lot on gospel teachings in the home and a lot of kind of parent to child interaction, and so I think that's a value that a lot of people have. And so especially if you're going through a faith transition or faith crisis and you're finding yourself either in a more nuanced or progressive space and maybe not as comfortable with some of the materials from the, in the mainstream church and or just outside of the church. I too, having worked with that population for decades now, I think I can say that. I think I can say decades. There is a lot of anxiety, right? Like, well, what do I offer my children now? And can we raise moral, value-centric, good, community-centric children with, without maybe the structure that is so paramount in our religious tradition, right? And so that's an anxiety that I see a lot of parents having. And then I also see a lot of traditional Mormons wanting other resources too, not just wanting, the things that the church provides, that they they recognize like there are digital issues, there's sexual issues, there's things, and what kinds of resources can we trust, that maybe the church isn't providing, but that we still want, good resources that are out there that can offer us some perspectives. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I'll just make a comment as this is kind of based on my work at Uplift. I'm not a parent, although the other members of the team are, but I have lots of conversations with our customers or parents. And it's interesting because, many of them, particularly if they come from a Latter-day Saint background, they get maybe a little hung up on, well, I don't know, I almost don't want to start some of these conversations because I don't know if I know the answers. I don't know what questions I'm going to be asked. And really what we're doing is providing some structure that can be helpful. I think people realize, having someone else who's kind of done some of the legwork, and it's so time consuming. We have a lot of customers who've tried to cobble together their own resources and feel so relieved when they can find Uplift and that work's been done for them, that way we can give them some structure and also a lot of room to be in exploration with their kids. That it's this is a shared journey and you don't need to know the answers, but you can offer your perspective, and you can, I think, maybe even use the questions that your kids might be asking you as an opportunity to revisit the question yourself, right? We're to be in a more kind of dynamic constructing and deconstructing what's true for us moment to moment. Feels really healthy and enlivening to me. And I think for a lot of folks, it's a transition because they are accustomed to feeling to sourcing their certainty from what I would say a false sense of knowing.
Right.
And that kind of comes from my meditative background, where you start to realize how little we know.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a shift that's happening even in kind of general parenting dynamics anyway, this 1950s authoritarian, top-down approach, father knows best, and, that we always need to have all the answers versus more conscientious parenting. That's like a famous parenting book that's out there, conscientious parenting, and having it be more, more of like a partnered approach. Not that it's completely democratic necessarily, but that it is a more like, share with me your thoughts and I'm going to share with you mine. And we're going to, have some ideas that we're going to talk about as a family is something. And to be able to say as a parent, I don't know, that's a good question. Is like a really amazing skill, I think, to be able to say as a parent versus, that anxiety that I have to know everything or else somehow my authority is diminished. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think there's another dimension to this too, with what I would say is more and more just the norm is mixed faith families. Mm-hmm. I would actually probably go so far as to say like every marriage is a mixed family. Every family is, because, our interior experience is going to be so unique and individual.
I would totally agree with that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I think just like embracing that and saying like, well, that is the starting point. Then how can, say, two partners, co-parenting together, be maybe honest about some differences in how they relate to different topics and model like that difference is a source of strength and like, and that it's okay. Like that our love can expand to hold all of this versus the kind of rooting the sense of love in shared belief, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's pivotal to having successful mixed faith families is to understand that that's an actual asset, right? Is that we can tolerate these differences and actually see that as a benefit to our family instead of it.
I would go so far, I'd go even further to say that like the family system is like yearning for greater and greater wholeness. Like in a way, it's going through a process of differentiation and integration. And that's a kind of like labor that is birthing the next like iteration of the family unit. And that each of the members of the family system have like a role to play. And those roles can be fluid, but at different points, like so mom's holding a certain pole and it's like really important for her to be like representing this value in the family because it's bringing greater health to the whole system. But we have a tendency to like pathologize and be threatened by and scapegoat certain values that maybe didn't previously, be recognized or were accepted or celebrated.
Right.
There's just a lot of challenge in that. And I think with Uplift, we want to be able to like equip parents to feel more confident to like lean into that.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. I love it. Anything that has the term differentiated in it, I'm a fan. So 70 lessons. That's a lot. You all have been busy.
We have been busy. And it marks a milestone because when we set out this year, we didn't really know what would happen. We just knew this felt important to us. We had some early feedback that people were interested, and we said, well, let's give this some concerted focus. Let's produce a lesson a week. And by the end of the year, we'll have something. And so we do. And now we're beginning to, as we go into 2022, we're making some adjustments, which we think are going to be really good for our audience and our customers. So one of those is that we've now offered more in the way of guidance through the curriculum. Really, someone can hop into the library if they have access to it, and they can pick and choose whatever they want to use. But we want to offer for folks who aren't sure where to start more direction. And so we have a program that we've mapped to the calendar for 2022. So every week there's like a lesson with a theme, and every day even there's like, a question prompt that a parent can reference. The whole family can see if they want to print the calendar and put it out somewhere. And we've paired that with a guided journal as well. And so there's a bit more of a way to just access the curriculum and feel held in a kind of structure as you move through it. And so we won't be producing a new lesson every week, although we'll continue to produce lessons because there are invariably, an endless number of topics that we could cover. But we are beginning to shift to more around kind of independent learning. So, if the lessons are really good about bringing parent and child together, but like how can we support children in their own discovery and their own curiosity? It doesn't depend on the parent being the media. the medium through which that information is delivered. So stories, more in the way of games, are things that we're exploring. And then on the flip side is how can we do more to support the development of parents, more in the way of kind of like education, courses potentially, so that they feel that they're also held with other like-minded parents. And as we kind of collectively discover this like what I call like a method of spiritual parenting. So spiritual parenting being distinct from like being similar to conscious parenting, meaning like, yeah, we're trying to bring our highest awareness. We're trying to really be aware of how we're doing what we're doing, but also bringing in this focus on the spirituality as like a line of intelligence. And there's research coming out of Columbia University as well as other universities, but Lisa Miller in particular is a professor out of Columbia. She's a professor in psychology, and she's written 2 books. The first one's called The Spiritual Child. That was published in 2015. The second one was just published in July. It's called The Awakened Brain. So she's breaking new ground on the science of spirituality. And in her first book, she's able to show through her research and research of her colleagues that this personal sense of spirituality, like, our personal connection to something greater, right? And it can go by many different names, God being one of them, is now been proven to be the single most effective, like kind of protective health benefit for teens and emerging adults. So in terms of like depression, substance abuse, physical risk-taking, high-risk sexual behavior, when someone has their own cultivated personal sense of spirituality, they are so much more protected against the sort of the dangers of that.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting concept because I've been reading some of the research around that too. And it also kind of goes along with the research, other terms, I guess, that you can talk about are meaning of life, purpose of life.
Mm-hmm.
Like we know that those terms have a lot to do with correlation with good mental health. But you throw out the word spiritual and all of a sudden, like people are like, whoa, what does that mean? And people get triggered and there's a lot of baggage that can come along with that word, especially if you have gone through a faith transition. And there's people who will say, well, I'm more comfortable considering myself an atheist or agnostic. And so what does that term have to do with me? And so I would love for you to, you kind of teased it a little bit, something bigger than myself. I would love for you to kind of expand on that. Like how we use that term and what's the variety of ways that we can use that?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking me to go deeper there because it's a fraught term. And I'll say, in terms of the research from my reading and understanding of it, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a real breakthrough when social scientists were able to, one, arrive at a consensus for the purposes of research as to what sort of spirituality is, and then 2, decouple it from religion. And so they found that, like, whether there are benefits, regardless of what the benefits are to religion and kind of like the outward adherence to a certain religion and practices and rituals and beliefs, like that in no way actually guarantees that the adherent will develop their own personal sense of spirituality. Mm-hmm. And someone who outside of any religious framework can develop a sense of spirituality. So they really are independent, although we've tend to bundle them together.
Yeah.
The way that like Lisa Miller defines it, and I think that's the way it's been used with research, is this idea of the transcendent relationship. Mm-hmm. And so there's something personal about it. There's some sense of maybe looking for guidance, some sense of help that can come from it. But beyond that, I mean, the expressions are as plentiful as there are probably people. And so, like we, for example, at Uplift include like secular humanism as like a wisdom tradition, like Greek philosophy, for in our view is very much like a wisdom tradition. And so someone doesn't necessarily need to believe in like the existence of God to, I think, reap the benefits of this more loosely defined term of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I know for some people it's
symbolism of
nature.
nature.
Yeah.
Some people there's like the universal energy, or just even power of the human kind of humanness, right? Of just human existence, right? And the power of the wisdom of the human experience. So it can be a lot of different things, including, of course, people's ideas of the divine and things of that nature as well. So, and I think some people even tap into a certain, like, almost like self-divinity, like there's something greater than your own self-consciousness. And so kind of tapping into something that's greater within, so.
If I could, if I could comment on that, couple things. One, I like to think about the three faces of spirit. And so we take this notion of spirit, but again, that's a word that may be uncomfortable for some people. But if those who are listening are uncomfortable with it, maybe fill in your own word for that. But there's this kind of like first person version of spirit, and in Christianity, it's the kingdom of God within. It's this sense of the divinity within myself. There's also then this sort of second person, relational, almost devotional aspect of spirit, which, where we see the divinity in another, and the idea in Hinduism of, namaste, and its real kind of original meaning is this kind of recognition of that spark in the other. And then this more third person, maybe more impersonal relationship to spirit or the divine, which is just kind of like the all and like the mystery and the awe that evokes in us. And I think about that a lot in our work at Uplift, because we sometimes use the word inner compass to describe how parents can help cultivate their children's relationship and connection to their own inner compass. Like, this is this kind of shift that we're supporting, that, you want children to look to trusted adults and elders, and if it's appropriate and it's in your family culture, to traditions and whatnot, to begin to develop what's true for them. But ultimately, it's like, what is their heart knowing? And how do we create a protected space where a child can be held and have boundaries, but also explore and be curious and discover, and by so doing, kind of like own, like, this is my relationship and it's my inner compass and I can trust it and I know how it works. And that's something that's like kind of an intelligence that we are born with. And then as we develop other skills and other aspects of our being, we have kind of more ways to make contact with it and express it. So those three faces of spirit, in my view, also lend themselves to the cultivation of virtue. I look at something like this, like the first person version, as developing a kind of resilience. Like, when I know who I am truly, there's like this kind of indestructible quality potentially that someone can begin to tap into, that no matter my circumstances, no matter what I tell myself or what I perceive other people think about me, I know who I am. And then you've got with this, the view of the other, the opportunity for compassion. I don't just suffer for you because I see that you're in pain, but it's like, your pain is my pain. There's like deeper sense of it that's just like a natural byproduct. And then the awe, the wonder and the awe of like this magical universe that we're a part of. And so I really like thinking about how the work we're doing at Uplift can support that kind of cultivation in young people.
I love it. So
I did want to say one more thing on all that, because you commented about, I forget how you put it, something about the sense of self. And you kind of talked about, because we're talking, about mental health and also about spirituality.
Yes.
For me, I'm really interested in contributing to the fruition of a spiritually oriented psychology, where if I want to draw some lines and distinctions, psychology is about that, like, kind of healthy ego, right? How do we kind of integrate these parts of ourselves that we've disowned? How do we kind of clean up stuff from the past so that we can be more, just have a kind of a clear sense of self and wholeness and healthiness. But there's also an aspect of like kind of transcending our identification with our small self, our personality, and recognizing that, like, again, in terms of the transcendent, it's just that move toward oneness. Like, oh, we're a part of the all. Like, we're just like a component of that. And so both of those pieces working together, to me, is like really powerful. And that's a bit of, I think that's part of our project at Uplift, is to support a fuller expression of this spiritually oriented psychology. So beginning to have conversations with clinicians who have the scientific training, they understand the research, they have the clinical experience as well, but who have their own understanding of spirituality from a personal standpoint, but also maybe from being lived from within a tradition. So they understand the symbolic landscape of a tradition. They can speak to it from the inside out, right? They understand like the language and what things mean. Like, I'm really interested over time in how Uplift might build partnerships and collaborations with like a network of experts, including clinicians, maybe also spiritual directors, so that when a family decides that they need something like Uplift, they're given like, here's content, here's like a method for applying it, here's like supportive resources in the form of like-minded people that maybe you just want to other families you want to collaborate with. But beyond that, like kind of experts who kind of in the eyes of Uplift are able to hold both the wisdom and the science together as being valuable.
Yeah. No, that's lovely. That's a lovely integration. We'll have to maybe have you all come and speak sometime to the Mormon Mental Health Association or something, and do that little integration piece for sure. I'd love that. So maybe with the last piece of our interview, I'd love to maybe come full circle and kind of come back to you a little bit in regards to, you mentioned kind of going back to your own lens of therapy and your own lens of like figuring out your journey through Mormonism and how that informed some of the lessons and some of the content that you brought to Uplift. So when you think about it from that perspective, how did that inform Uplift?
Yeah, well, I'll say,
if it's not too personal, yeah.
Well, no. I feel very comfortable talking about this. I'm just more sensitive to time. Let's just
talk for 3 hours about all that.
No. Yeah. So, I mean, in my late 20s, young single adult, haven't been married, done my best to be a, upstanding, good Mormon boy. And I go into therapy for the first time, and I start to, I think, dredge up stuff from the past. And it wasn't until I became sexually active a couple years after that, and then that experience over time as it progressed was more difficult and not as enjoyable as I anticipated it being. And I realized that I had a lot of guilt and shame about having these sexual experiences, and that I had never been married in the temple. I hadn't kind of honored my covenants. And even though in my mind, my rational mind, I felt like, oh, I kind of moved on, gone in a different direction. These ideas, these beliefs were so deep in me and in my body. And so I think, when I alluded to kind of revisiting the past, for me, it was a lot of sexual shame. And I guess, and then, that gets bound up in, I don't know, just this identity of, well, I'm bad, or I'm, it can become so just to be just identified with it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then that causes us to do all sorts of things maybe to compensate for that. I would say a lot of my career ambition early on, in retrospect, I think was like, don't look too closely at me. Don't see me for who I really am, because I've absorbed these introjections of who I might be as a kind of a bad person. Look at my success, look at my accomplishment, see that instead. And the more I did the kind of therapeutic work, and also in conjunction with more meditation, I'm shining a brighter and brighter light in the basement, and descending into the dark. And I'm finding some kind of uncomfortable experiences from the past, interactions with bishops, stuff like that. And I guess, I don't know, I've kind of arrived on the other side of that as much as anyone can, and find so much power in our connection to our sexuality. It's our erotic, creative life force energy. Mm. And I feel like, I mean, we all, it's coursing through all of us. And I have it, and I want to use it to give birth to beautiful ideas in the world. Uplift is one of them. And I hope that my contribution to Uplift in some way is helping the next generation of children who are growing up to remain connected to their life force, which is only possible if they remain connected to their sexuality.
Oh, that's beautiful, Drew. Yeah, that's really intense. I run a male sexual shame group, and we were just talking about this last night. You know, the cost of seeing your sexuality as either sick or evil or untrustworthy in some way or another. And then especially I think for people who are raised as boys, that confessional kind of ritualistic going in at such an early age and talking about things that are really quite natural, but yet from this cinephized perspective with this power authority.
Yeah,
it was really, it is every time I run the group, but it's always so powerful to hear these men talk about how heavy that is for them to carry that weight of that internalized shame. So I love the language that you're using to frame that in a very different way.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll just offer, like, you know, in my journey with it, my process, there were some different moments of recognition. Some cases where, like, I really saw the experience more honestly, and it hurt, but it was part of like bringing it into the light and transmuting it and releasing the energy that was stuck there. But realizing that, like, my very first sort of sexual experience which was with masturbation, it's like a very young teenager, was coupled with guilt. Like the very first experience with it. And that, like, all of my early informative sexual experiences, which really, I was such a good boy, you know, like it was in the grand scheme of things and in kind of some relative sense, like I was, and yet I carried such a heavy, it was so heavy for me. And that's maybe another conversation as to why circumstantially and temperamentally it carried maybe even an extra dose of heaviness. But like, I'm talking about sex with bishops, you know, or like sexual experience, sexuality with, like, I wasn't even like having those conversations necessarily with like my friends who were boys, because it was like we're all just like ashamed, and, you know, like just to normalize that. And but there was, I guess for me, it's like the lost innocence of it. Mm-hmm. You know, like,
yeah, and when you take it out of its cultural context with the rest of the world, it's very maladaptive, right? It's not typical. It's not a typical experience in most humans, right? To have that Mormon trajectory, right? That's happening.
And yet, I'll just say that I lived in the Bay Area for a couple of years, and as I was working through some of this too, and it was actually really healing to be in a group and to just have people kind of popcorn sharing different things, and to realize that, like, oh, I'm not like broken because I'm Mormon. Like people, even in the Bay Area, in this kind of libertine culture, have their struggles with sexuality, because frankly, like, sexuality is like mysterious and powerful and like the most vulnerable and intimate parts of ourselves and our expression. And so, like, kind of to give ourselves a little bit of a break, like, yeah. And then
sexual shame is like an inheritance that I think puritanical America has inherited in lots of different ways and shapes and forms, right? So Mormonism by no means is the only entity, right? That
I mean, with the you know, Adam and Eve and just our deep Judeo-Christian heritage, which is seeped into culture, you know.
Yeah,
it's there.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you're bringing a sexual component to Uplift, because as a sex therapist, I often see that part missing in curriculums, especially curriculums for children and adolescents, right? So a lot of times there's great curriculums about all kinds of things, but the sex piece is kind of like not mentioned.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad that that's actually incorporated into, this program that you're building. So I think that's very healthy.
Yeah. In addition to the first lesson, which I think will be the first of many that we produced about sexuality, we included a roundup of resources on kind of the main, big subtopics under sexuality, so that as a parent, begins to open up for maybe more conversations, and what we said is really an ongoing conversation about this topic, that they can feel like they have resources to turn to if questions come up that they don't feel equipped to answer. And those resources were also vetted by a clinician. We've also produced a lesson on LGBTQ+, similarly paired it with supplemental resources. And I think that's a pattern that we intend to kind of continue, because we want to tackle the charged hard topics. We have to.
Yes.
But we also want to do it in a way that holds as many perspectives as possible and has kind of an extra layer of review and support from someone with your kind of qualifications.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, this has been a very lovely discussion, and I'm excited to dive in myself more into your product and find out more about it. Is it like you purchase the lessons? Is it a subscription? Explain a little bit more about how people can access the program itself.
Yeah, for now it's an annual membership, $99 a year, includes access to the full digital lesson library, which you can find on our website, upliftkids.org. Like I said, it also includes the printable calendar, kind of program to follow, as well as the guided journal. Yeah, and then we send out emails every week. We have done some calls with parents. Yeah, we're looking to offer more of that. We're starting to maybe look at doing interviews with experts on different topics. So if we want to go deep on a certain topic, that would be supportive for parents to understand, whether that be like a discussion topic or more like a practice. Like at Uplift, we think about giving parents, families, like language and practices and like a framework within which to hold all that, there's a structure, but that they can kind of pick and choose what works for them. They're kind of creating their own culture in their home around this stuff. So yeah, these are all the different kinds of resources we're beginning to produce to support that mission.
Okay. And you can find all of this at upliftkids.org, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And I love it. It's an integration of family health, spiritual health, sexual health, psychological health. So a lot of different components that really go into the complexities of parenting and giving resources to parents. So thank you so much. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about or that you'd want to kind of finish up with as far as just kind of a last thought or information that maybe, I didn't ask a good question about?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Flew by.
Yeah, Drew, no, for sure. This is a great resource. I'm so glad because it's just been something, it's so nice now to be able to say, oh, there's a resource instead of, this is really hard. I get it. And a lot of times in my presentations with families, I'm like, so now instead of like plugging them into the system, you have to kind of come up with your own curriculum. Yeah, that's kind of what you have to do. And now I'm like, now there's this upliftkids.org. So I love it. So thank you and your team for providing this excellent thing. I've heard really good things about it from people who've purchased it. So thank you for being on.
Yeah,
and for all of those of you who are listening, if you have any questions, I'm sure you can contact the team. And so make sure you visit their website. And like I said at the beginning, please consider a donation to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. We can't really run this completely without your support. And did you have another comment?
I was just going to say, for those who do go to our website, if they submit their email, they can join our mailing list. They can get a better feel for what we're doing. They can also start a 2-week free trial. So you can start the trial for free and check out any lesson you want. And and then move on to the membership from there if it's a fit.
Perfect. That's even better. All right. So you can get a taste and see if it's a good fit for you, and then go from there. Awesome. All right, Drew. You have a great evening and a good holiday season if I don't see you before then. So
sounds good. Thanks, Natasha. Right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear